So I think we're going to get started. It's straight up 6 o'clock, and I know it's a very busy night in Moscow. I'm not sure there are any not busy nights in Moscow. But thank you so much for being here this evening on a really snowy night and for joining us on this really celebratory occasion. My name is Dulcie Kirsting. I know a lot of you in the room, and I'd love to meet you all before the night is out. I am the Executive Director of the Latah County Historical Society, and we partnered with the City of Moscow to bring waterways to our community this year. And I really encourage you to take the time to really take in all of the content that's in this exhibit. I know it's a lot of information, and so if you have the opportunity to come back a second or a third time, maybe bring family if you have people here over the holidays, I really encourage you to do so. And if you haven't made it to the third floor yet, we also have a companion exhibit about local water history that was curated by the Historical Society. So it is my pleasure to welcome Gina Terusio, who is a member of Moscow City Council, and I really can't say enough about how wonderful a partner the City of Moscow has been on this project. So thank you, Gina.
Is this exciting or what? I'm just so excited to be here, and I'm clunking into the tray here, so if I look like I'm dancing, I really am. I want to thank you for being here. Hello, everybody. I do know a few of you out here. It's good to see you. Welcome to what is 3rd Street Gallery, ending up being 3 floors of beautiful. So please do, like Dulcie said, come here a couple times. Soak it all in. It's a very cool exhibit. They gave me the exciting job of being able to thank specific people, so I'm going to read from my notes a little bit. So I apologize for that inelegant approach. Scott and Dalton from the City Parks and Rec and Facilities Department, thank you very much for your help on that. Nicole, sweet Nicole, and Kelly from the Water Department, thank you very much. Okay, Jessica's in here. Jessica, Daniel, Zach, and DJ. Zach's behind, you can't see him, but those guys all have done a humongous amount of work on this as well, so thank you all. Aaron, Ashland, Linnell, Ken, and Steve from the Latah County Historical Board of Trustees. You guys, that's very cool. Thank you very much. Kind of a cool thing we're very excited about is that we are going to be hosting school tours with this exhibit as well. We have Moscow, Potlatch, Genesee, and Clarkston, Washington all committed to come and view our exhibit in the next month. That's gigantic. That is very, very exciting. Thanks again to my friend that I met 3 minutes ago, Steve Robischon. You're going to be our speaker tonight. I'm excited about that. The next gentleman I get to introduce is kind of my partner in crime nowadays. Seems like you're always at the table with me. This is my friend, Tom Lamar. He is our Latah County Commissioner as well as the Executive Director of the PCEI. So Tom, come on up.
Well, I really enjoy water. I've been working on it a long time, and as Gina said, in my role with the Palouse Clearwater Environmental Institute for the last 26 years, I've had a lot of opportunity to collaborate with the City of Moscow on lots of different issues having to do with water. The many years of Paradise Creek cleanups, a lot of the work that we're doing with water conservation. It's all been terrific, and it's great to work with the city on all of those issues. Somebody just recently shared with me a picture from 1991 where I was being interviewed sitting down next to Paradise Creek during one of the first creek cleanups, and it was pretty fun to see that. But this particular exhibit is a terrific way through the Latah County Historical Society, and I just wanted to thank Dulcie so much for all of her work. 18 months ago, I think we learned about this grant, and with working with the Smithsonian and all of the support that the Latah County Historical Society has given her to make this happen for the county and the Historical Society to be able to work with the City of Moscow to bring this exhibit here, and not only to bring these 2 floors, the first floor and the second floor, which come from the Smithsonian, but then to also develop the display that's all over the 3rd floor. So it's a terrific display. It really focuses in on Latah County and the City of Moscow, and you'll want to make sure you have a chance over the next month to come back here and spend time with those different displays, because they're really wonderful. I certainly didn't have nearly enough time tonight just to look at everything. And there's, it's great to have the Smithsonian here. They are the museum system for the United States, and to be able to bring them to Moscow is really an honor. And we have Dulcie and the Historical Society to thank for making that happen. I just have, there's so much here. I really don't want to spend time going into all of this, but I did want to mention that the National Endowment for the Humanities and the Idaho Humanities Council have been wonderful to work with to allow this to be possible, to come to Moscow, and to be able to have it for the other citizens of Latah County. And I'm hoping that we're going to be able to take that upstairs exhibit on us in our future county commission meetings when we go around to the different communities. Maybe we can have some panels, or maybe we can somehow be able to make that work, because it's nice to be able to be available for the other residents of Moscow, or for other residents of Latah County, not just the ones here in Moscow. So it's my honor also to introduce Steve Robischon. I have an opportunity to work with Steve a long time ago when I was going to PBAC meetings just as the director of PCEI, but now as the representative for Latah, or one of the representatives for Latah County, to the Palouse Basin Aquifer Committee. And the Palouse Basin Aquifer Committee has been very lucky for the last 10 or 11 years to have Steve serve as our executive director. And he's been terrific. He is leaving next month. And we are in the process of trying to hire his replacement. But the good news is that he is going to stay on as the technical advisor for us on PBAC. So we still have an opportunity to work with him into the future. But he's moving on to other things, and we will have to fill those shoes of his with somebody else, or with multiple other people. So. And many of you have had a chance to hear Steve speak at the various Palouse Basin water summits that we've had, and it's always a pleasure to hear from Steve. So I'm just going to turn it over to you. Thanks, Steve, for being here.
Thank you, everyone. If it's okay, I'm going to move over that way, because my eyesight is way worse than any of yours, and so I probably won't be able to see things unless I move over a little bit. Can you still hear me now? Okay. The first thing I noticed about this talk was I should have changed the title to A History of Our Groundwater, because we know there's no such thing as the history. So think of this as A history. It's some stuff that I've come across in the last 10 years that I find interesting, and I hope you find interesting too. I tend to put way too many slides into way not enough time, so I'm going to be going really quickly through this. Hopefully you'll be able to catch this as it goes. I'm going to start out with some historical geology, but before that I have a pop quiz, because I like people to be involved in these discussions. So the question is, what's the elevation at this location? Can anybody tell me what it is, roughly? Wow, that's pretty good. All those answers are passing, okay? My answer is about 2,600, right? I didn't know second floor, things like that. Okay, the next question is harder. Let's go back, say, 17 million years. What was the elevation of this spot 17 million years ago? Sea level, okay. Anybody else? That's a little bit too far, but that's pretty close. About 17 million years ago, we were about 1,000 feet above sea level. And this is a topographic map from 17 million years ago. It's kind of an old map, right? So, and we're sitting right about here, and that line is the 1,000-foot line. So we were at about 1,000 feet above sea level 17 million years ago, and now we're at 2,600 feet. So how did that happen? What happened to go from 1,000 to 2,600? Lost a lot of seawater? Okay, that could have been it, right? Sinking, maybe it's a big sinkhole. Really, probably what happened is that, right? So about 17 million years ago, the Earth opened up when we were kind of over that hot spot that's now underneath Yellowstone Park, and it got hot enough that lava started coming out of the surface of the Earth. And the basalt flooded the area over a huge extent. This is the extent of what the basalt flows covered. So they went almost all the way to Portland. And you can see, well, you might not be able to see, but this is over 10,000 feet in thickness in the middle of the Columbia Basin. This is called the Columbia River Basalt Group. Here is our basin over here. So you can see we're kind of at the edge of where the basalt flows are, and that makes it kind of complicated to figure out what's going on. So we have these fingers of basalt that came out from the larger flows and solidified as they ran up against the highlands, like Moscow Mountain and Steptoe and Kamiak Butte and places like that. Okay, so I'm going to go through quickly kind of a time lapse of what might have happened from the geologists who studied the area. And this is starting about 16.7 million years ago. Basalt lava flows came in from the southwest, so they're purple here. And this yellow is sediment. So Moscow Mountain, how many people know how high Moscow Mountain was 17 million years ago? How about today, what is it? Okay, 5,000, 5,500. 17 million years ago, it was 7,000, right? So thousands of feet of Moscow Mountain have eroded and run off with the rain and the snow and the melt. And sediment, you can imagine it running into these lava flows. So the lava flow might stop, and then sediment runs over and kind of puddles here, and you can imagine it gets kind of like clay, like the bottom of a pond or a lake. So we see lots of clays in this Moscow area, because where the basalt flows ended and the mountain eroded off, the fine stuff settled to the bottom and we have a lot of clay. So that's one of the things that we experience on the Moscow side of the basin that we don't experience so much in the Pullman. So I'm going to go through a time lapse here, and what you're going to see is time marching on and what the geologists believe happened in terms of these subsequent flows of basalt coming through. So another flow comes on top, another flow comes on top, and we're marching through time. We're now at 16 million years ago. One of the things you'll notice here is as time moved on and these basalt flows come in and we're building up more and more sediments and clays here, the streams are diverted to the north. So we're used to seeing streams that go to the west, but back then the streams were diverted to the north. And so we have these ancient stream channels beneath what's today's land surface that have coarser sediments in them, and we have a bunch of clays in here. So again, this is really complicated with thinking about recharge and where the water comes from and where it's going. This side at the edge of the basin is really a complicated place. Okay, some of it even came in from the north. Then we moved into what we now call the upper aquifer, and we got to the very end, and this is kind of where we were at 12 million years ago. Things kind of started to settle down. Okay, if you try to look at this from the side now, you see that we have a lot of complicated kind of fingers or layers of basalt with sediment underneath and sediment over on the Moscow side of the basin. Over in Pullman, it's more or less just layers and layers of basalt. So it's two different geologies between Moscow and Pullman, but we're sharing the water resources between here because the water can continuously move between these two, we've learned. This is just another chart that gives you a cross-section of what it looks like from the side. Again, we have a lot of sediments in Moscow and mostly basalts in the Pullman area. And so when you think about one of these flows, the flows themselves aren't uniform. At the top, you see these little bubbles of where the gases in the lava weren't able to escape before the lava cooled down. So there's these pores inside the lava up on top. Down below, where the lavas ran over water, we have these big pillow lavas and lots more sediment. So this is where the water hangs out in the basalt. It's at the top and the bottom of the flows. So as these flows come in, there's flow, sediment, flow, and the water storage happens kind of between the subsequent flows. Inside the interiors of the flow, there's really no room for much water. So it's not like we have a big pool of water under the ground. We have a lot of really solid, dense basalt, and we have these zones between flows with sediment and the things that have room for water, which is where the water's stored. Okay, I'm going to fast forward now. We're done with that ancient stuff. Now we're into the time when there's people tromping around, right? So people weren't tromping around back then. Now they're tromping around enough to make maps. So this is in the 1870s. Here's a map of the area, right? And in 1873, they sent the surveyor out to make the border between Idaho and Washington territories. So this is a map of the border between Idaho and Washington territories from the confluence of the Snake and the Clearwater, which is here, and then it proceeds that way and that way and that way, and it goes 90 miles to the north. So that's the border map from 1873. If you take this one chunk and you rotate it around, this is the part of the first survey of the area that encompasses the Palouse. So Pullman would be on this side and Moscow would be on this side back in 1873. It's kind of hard to see here. There is showing some stream going through here and a little bit of stream going up here, but not a lot of streams crossing the border back then. This is a copy of the field notes from the 1873 survey. They really had nice penmanship back then. And here are what the notes look like when you pull them out. Unlimited supply of breadstuff, grass keeping green and fresh nearly all summer, abounding in camas affording fine food for swine, and of course everyone knows that the Paradise Valley was formerly known as hog heaven because of the camas and the greens. So it was a little bit different 150 years or so ago. This takes that border map and it overlays it on a modern map. Sorry about that, I went too fast. Overlays it on a modern map that shows the modern drainages. These aren't all active drainages. Some of them are intermittent and not active all the time. So you can see where the border map goes. Here's Moscow, here's Pullman. I'm going to zoom in some more. So if I zoom in to this area right here, I see that there is a little bit of a stream that crosses the border, and these notes say stagnant water in holes, 5 to 10 links. A survey chain has links, and each link is like 8 inches wide. So that's maybe 80 inches wide stream bed here with stagnant water in it. Okay. Down a little bit farther south, you can see there's a bridge here and another little stream that crosses. Bed of creek, now dry. So the two places where we thought there was water back in 1873, when the surveyors came through in August, stagnant water and dry stream. So there really wasn't any active water crossing the border back then. Some more notes. Talks a little bit about who's living here, right? 200 inhabitants, 50 families, an equal number of bachelors. After they got the border done, which is the yellow line now, the surveyors started working away from the border, surveying townships at a time. This is another survey from 1873. I'm going to zoom in a little bit to this area right here, which would be north of Moscow. This drainage, there's still a drainage there, comes out right about Airport Road. And if you look at the map, you see that this says South Fork of the Palouse River. So that's what they used to call the South Fork of the Palouse River back in 1873. Not this one that's coming in now from the south and going into Pullman. So this was probably the main drainage back in 1873. Dry in summer. So even the main drainage didn't have water in it in the summer. Okay, this is the southern portion of that map. And if you look again, you can see that these pieces that might be kind of where Paradise Creek is now, like this piece right here, it doesn't make it across the border, right? And you can see up here that it's dry. So what is now Paradise Creek was not Paradise Creek in 1873. So it's all different than it was 150 years ago. This is the piece that's south of Pullman, and this is what's now the South Fork of the Palouse River. And if I zoom in here closer to Pullman, I see right in here where the South Fork is coming in, you can see that the Palouse Creek, 35 links, so that's pretty wide stream bed there. So that was actually a live drainage back in 1873. There was enough water in the summer to actually have flow in that. Didn't make it across the border here, didn't make it across the border here, but there was water that was coming in from down here. So it was a different picture back then, is the story. Here's a picture of Moscow in 1883, different back then, right? So there weren't a lot of trees in Moscow back then. There might have been 50 families and just as many bachelors, but there weren't very many trees yet because there wasn't really a lot of water to be putting on trees. So people couldn't afford to spend their water on trees. Here's a map of central Moscow in 1889. So this is the way downtown Moscow looked. Here's Main Street, 1889. Here's 3rd. Oh, I keep zooming forward. Sorry about that. Oh, there we go. So I'm going to rotate this in. Oh, there we go. This is the seal on the map, and you see that the water facilities in Moscow are not good. By then, there's 1,000 people in town. So it's really growing quickly. If I look at the Pullman map, in 1889, same time period, there's only 500 people. So there were twice as many people in Moscow as Pullman back then, but their water facilities were no good also. So water was really a challenge back in the late 1800s in the area. Okay, this is an 1883 photo of the Barton house, which is now where the Moscow Hotel is. There's a guy named M.C. True who was from Indiana. His family was a hotel family, and so he learned how to take care of hotels, and he moved to Moscow. In 1880, he leased and ran the Barton house. So he was the guy that leased and ran the Barton house. 2 years later, he moved to Pullman, because Pullman said, if you come to Pullman we'll give and build a hotel, we'll give you 4 lots. So he said, okay, I'm out of here, Moscow, and he went over to Pullman, and he got those 4 lots right there. And those 4 lots right here is where he built his hotel, and this is where Pullman City Hall is right now. So M.C. True moved from Moscow to Pullman to get these 4 lots. He built his Palace Hotel right there. And around 1889 or so, he decided he was going to move the Palace Hotel from City Hall out to Main Street. He was going to move the hotel out here. So this would be where, like, Basilio's is, right? And he wanted to have water, good water, in his new hotel. So he hired somebody to drill a well. There were no drilled wells in the area. Everybody had shallow dug wells, and that's how they got their water, from cisterns that were dug into shallow wells. Okay, this is a picture of the Palace Hotel in 1891 after it's moved to Main Street. May 25th, 1889, the driller strikes water out behind the Palace Hotel, which would be in the parking lot of Basilio's. And there was so much pressure in the water that he struck that the water came out on the surface and flowed on the surface. So this is the first flowing artesian well in the area, May 25th, 1889. Big news, because now there was good water, good, clean, cold water. It wasn't that dirty water in the dug well cistern that was all warm and yucky and stuff like that. So this is a big deal. The city dads, according to the newspaper, still didn't think it was worth spending the money to pay M.C. True for some of the water to put a water system in. So they wouldn't spend any money to put a water system in, to put a fire system in to protect from fires, because there were a lot of fires back then, but they weren't ready to spend money on that yet. Unfortunately, the town burned down a little bit later, right? And that used to happen a lot, because before there was electric lights, everybody used lanterns and candles. Sidewalks were wood, buildings were wood, everything was just ready to torch at any time. And so on July 5th, 1890, a lot of Pullman burned down. This is after they had water, but before they had a fire system. Then they decided, well, maybe the city needs a fire system, so they drilled their own well, and in 1891 they struck water, and this is their first well from 1891. This one was sited, those of you who know of that little fountain out there in the back parking lot behind the library in Pullman, that's where Pullman's first city well was. And again, you can see it's a big deal. There's a lot of people hanging out looking at that. This guy really is excited about it. So this was a big deal back then. And there's a lot of stories I've seen about people like this guy who didn't go anywhere without his dog. And there's a bunch of neat people in this story, so that's another history in itself. Okay, Pullman's got water now. They start planting trees, because when you have a nice place you want to live, you're going to want to have trees and you want to have shade, so they started planting trees as soon as they had water. A guy named Philip Bremer said, I'm going to go north and see what it's like. He went up to see if he could find a better place, couldn't find a better place. One of the main reasons he said he couldn't find a better place is we got water, right? So it was really a big deal. Pullman had water, nobody else had water, it was the place to be. So the Palace Hotel burns a little bit later, 1895, and according to this story, it was a total loss. But I found this from 1906, which is the Palace Hotel. So apparently it wasn't a total loss. They were able to rebuild the Palace Hotel. One of the early articles about the Palace Hotel said that M.C. True was so happy that there was enough pressure in the well that he dug to get water all the way up to the 3rd floor. So people could have water closets up in their 3rd floor rooms, and that was really luxury back then. Okay, Moscow had a fire in 1889. People in Moscow said, we got to do something about this, right? It's not like Pullman, who said, we don't want to do anything about it. Moscow doesn't even have good water, and they say we're going to bond ourselves for $30,000 to build a waterworks. So the people in Moscow were a little bit more forward-thinking back then, saying, we need to do this, we're going to pay for it now, it's going to help us down the road. So they bonded themselves $30,000 to build a waterworks. Didn't even know if they could get water. So they said it's going to be expensive, but we're going to do it anyway. May 9th, 1890, Moscow strikes water. This is a little bit west of where the water building is now in Moscow, is where they found that they struck the first water. Again, there was enough pressure for it to flow at the surface, and they figured they were in like Flynn because there was going to be plenty of water for everybody. You can see a little bit of the competition that was going on back then. Moscow was feeling kind of bad because everybody's saying, ha-ha, in Pullman you don't have any water and we do. Well, Moscow's saying, now we got water too, so ha-ha. Moscow says, now that we got water, we're going to have shrubbery too. So we're going to get trees. We're going to make it a nice place to live forever. Last year people jeered at us because we didn't have water, but now we got water. And not only do we have water, we have the lead because we have 4 wells and they only have 2. Right? So you see competition, you see cooperation through time, but there's always been a little bit of both, but generally they both cooperate. This is the first pool on the Palouse. This was in Pullman, and in June 26, 1891, it opened, and I had to look the pronunciation of this up online. It's chalybeate, and chalybeate means iron containing, and so that's a hint that the first wells that they drilled in Pullman were from what we call the upper aquifer now, because there's a lot of iron in the upper aquifer. And so here's a picture of where that first city well in Pullman is. They had made a fountain by then, kind of like a miniature version or a big version of the fountain that's there right now. And there's the pool. Okay? Main tank is 12 feet deep, but the ladies and persons who cannot swim have to stay in the 4-foot end. Right? And forget about the fact that back in 1891, the ladies couldn't even vote. Right? So it was a whole different world back then. They built the bottling works. Okay, the bottling works were going to be really great, and they were going to serve temperance drinks. And I didn't know what that was either, but temperance drinks are things like sarsaparilla. And I always thought it was sarsaparilla, but it's sarsaparilla. And ginger beer and things like that. And these were going to be the greatest drinks ever because they're using this wonderful water that Pullman has and no one else has. The water was healthy, and so they did a little microscopy on it back in 1891, microscopy, and they found that it was really old, right, when the morning stars sang. And it scratches the desiccated mucus off the small clack valve of the pancreatic duct. So this is really healthy water, right? I don't know how to pronounce this, but it's kind of like a cough, I think. When they begin to drink this water, they have inward astonishment. The colon feels like a tight riata. That's good water. You suddenly get an appetite like a fever convalescent, right? So this is really good water, and you can only get it in Pullman because that's where the good water is. Okay, 1891 now. Both towns have wells. Moscow's bonded themselves to build a water system, and they decided to build what's called a standpipe, and the standpipe would be used to put pressure in the water system so everybody could have pressurized water. Here is a bird's eye view from 1897. A lot of you have probably seen this around. The Historical Society used to have copies of this, maybe still do. Still do. It's a really neat thing. When you zoom into a couple pieces of this is the waterworks. And this is basically the current location of the water building right now, the water department building. So they had a lot of smokestack coming out of there because they had to drive the pumps to pump the water up to the standpipe. So in order to get the pumps to work, they used wood. And in the newspaper, there was an article that said there's a lot of tramps in Moscow, so the city should put them to work sawing wood for the waterworks. And so I always wondered where all the employees from the water department came from. Anyway, they got the pumps working, they burned the wood, drive the pumps, pump the water up to, let me do this again, to the standpipe. There's the standpipe, 1907. And that's kind of up behind Russell, up at the top of the hill behind Russell. And so they'd pump the water into the standpipe. When they filled the standpipe, you can imagine that the pressure down here is really high, so they were able to pressurize the line so everyone would have pressurized water. Okay, I'm back to Pullman now, 1890. When the territories became states, there was a few plums that everybody wanted to have to make their town survive. One of them was the prison. That was always a good thing. County seat was a good thing, right? State fair was a good thing. And another good thing was the ag school. So if you could get the ag school, that kind of guaranteed you some permanence. And permanence was a big deal because towns were going out and failing all the time. So Pullman really wanted to get the ag school. And the governor appointed a commission to go around eastern Washington and find the place to site the ag school. So Pullman wined and dined this commission, but one of the main places they took the commission was to the artesian wells. And so here's a picture of the locating commission. This guy even brought his cup to get some of that Coleman Riata stuff. This was basically the thing that they said back from the paper swayed the commission to choose Pullman as the location of WSU. And so you see in May 22nd, the commission and the legislators decide Pullman becomes the home of the Ag College, and you can see this Pullman seal is now known as the Artesian City. So water really had a big role to play in Pullman becoming what it is today. Okay, we had that competition, but now the people in Moscow are saying, yay, we're going to cooperate with you. We're glad you're succeeding because we're all going to succeed together. So this spirit of cooperation continues on today, and this is the kind of thing that's going to get these towns and this region out of this problem that we have of not having enough water to support long term. This is another picture of the second artesian well. It would be a kind of across Main Street from the first artesian well in May of 1890. Here's a souvenir postcard that was made of that. It was so important that they put it on their souvenir postcards. When you look in a little bit of detail at the postcard, you see this is the Bank of Pullman. Okay? When you look at the real photo, that's the Bank of Pullman. So they were able to use a little bit of poetic license in their souvenir postcards back then, right? The shallower wells started to decline because they didn't cap them in many cases. They used the water levels declined, and so in 1913 Pullman drilled a well into what's now considered the deep aquifer or the lower aquifer, and this is that well, 1913. This one was located kind of behind the old Pullman building supply. And you can see again it was still a big deal. This one flowed at 3 million gallons a day, so this is a lot of water coming out of this one. And you can see that water conservation folks are probably going to say, why don't they cap that thing off if 3 million gallons a day are flowing down the stream? Eventually they do that, but early on they let a lot of water go because they didn't have things capped off. So this is the first lower aquifer well in 1913. They didn't really have many problems. Then in 1923 there appeared to be some problems. Folks asked the Idaho School of Mines to look at it, and the report came out that said, we're good to go. Don't have to worry about it. We got a lot of water for a long time. Okay, so now I'm going to do a little bit of hydrogeology just so you kind of get an idea of the way that the aquifer system works. We consider having kind of two different aquifer systems, the lower or the deep aquifer, some of you might think of as the Grand Ronde aquifer. The shallow aquifer is called the Wanapum aquifer. And so in this sketch, the blue and this yellow sediment above the green is the shallow aquifer. So the blue and the yellow sediment right here and above is the shallow aquifer, the upper aquifer. The rest of it is the deep aquifer. So before 1913, everybody was working out of this. 1913, Pullman tapped this. Moscow stayed in the upper aquifer until the 50s, and I'll show you how you can tell that in a minute. Okay, so here's the land surface. Back in 1913, when Pullman drilled into the deep aquifer, the water level was up there above the surface. Water was flowing at the surface. Go to today, that's where the water level is. So that's what's happened since 1913. Now the water level is about 100 feet below ground in Pullman, so we've lost about 100 and maybe 15 or 20 feet because there was enough pressure to go 15 or 20 feet at that time. Water levels have declined. And this is a hydrograph that shows that from 1935 up to the present. These different colors are different wells, but you can see pretty much steady decline in water level. Steady decline in water level tells you that we're using more water than is going in, right? It's not sustainable. At some point, that chart is going to reach the bottom of the water, and we're not going to have any water. Here we have the upper aquifer. This, you can tell, is the water building. This is where Moscow Well 2 is located. Well 3 is out behind here. These are upper aquifer wells. And here's a similar hydrograph for the upper aquifer. And you can see water levels were going down in the upper aquifer until the late 50s, and for some reason then they turn around and come back up. And what happened is, around this time, UI and the city of Moscow drilled into the deep aquifer, and they didn't have to pump in the upper aquifer as much. So when they took the pumping pressure off the upper aquifer came back. So this is evidence that the upper aquifer does have a sustainable level of pumping. There is a level of pumping at which we can just have continuously level upper aquifer water levels, but you can see that maybe in the past 10 years or so, we've been pumping more out of the upper aquifer than is sustainable. So we may be over-pumping the upper aquifer now, too. This is from 1949. This is the UI yearbook, I guess is what I would call it. There were a couple of players from 1949, Kenneth Dick, who was the bursar, and George Gajan, and he was the engineer. They got together and said, we're going to have a water problem. We need to do something about this, or the university's going to be in trouble. So they went to the regents. The regents said, go ahead and do something about it. These two guys got together with folks from Moscow, WSU, and Pullman to try to see if they could figure out something jointly to do to solve this problem of declining water levels. Okay, they made a report in 1968 saying we all got together, we had meetings, and all evidence to date says that within 10 years, more or less, we got a problem, a major water emergency. So this is 1968. They're predicting 1978, a major water emergency. So we got to do something about it. Okay, they say that it's not a really easy problem to solve. The South Slope doesn't have enough water, and there's a lot of silt. There's issues with that. We're going to need to get water from a major river. It's going to be expensive. We all need to get together to solve this problem. There's going to be issues about legislation and things like that we're going to have to deal with. They got together, they put together a solution, which is go out east of Beauville on the Potlatch River and build some dams out there. And so they made a proposal. They told the Idaho Department of Water Resources, we want a permit to build this reservoir and get the water. They said, we want to divert 33.91 cubic feet per second. Today, we use about 12 cubic feet per second. So back then, they were asking for almost 3 times as much as we use today. They were asking for a lot of water. Okay? That was the plan. Solve the problem. Unfortunately, a lot of people thought that maybe wouldn't solve the problem, but it might cause a problem, right? So the people that lived out in that area said, what's going on here? You're going to build a reservoir out here, and you're going to take the water to Moscow? We don't like that idea, right? We didn't even know about it. We just saw it in the paper when you filed for it. You had all this work that you'd done. You hadn't even come and talked to us. And you see this several times through the history where things get proposed before the community is on board and the community knows about it. So that's one of the lessons that history might teach folks is in the future, make sure that the community knows and the community's on board before you try to do things. So they had another meeting, crowd not convinced. There were 100 less than hostile people saying, no, do not do this, right? And so there was enough of them that UI and Moscow, who were the folks on the Idaho side of the line, said, you know, I don't think you need to worry about this because with so much public against this, it's just not going to happen, right? And the person from Kendrick says, the thing that bugged me was the secrecy of all this. So that was kind of a weird thing back in the 60s. Okay, 69, they said, well, let's ask these eggheads at the universities how long the water's going to last so that we know when we got to solve this problem. Because we got thousands of feet of basalt, right? We don't know that yet because we haven't drilled that deep. And it's only going down a foot a year, so we got a lot of water, right? How long is it going to last? So these two come back with a report that says, we got enough water to last till 2050 or 2100. This is kind of the state of the technology back in the 60s, kind of before the computers came along and made things easier to crunch numbers. So they did a status report in 1969 and said, you know, it's really complicated. We don't know for sure what's going on. We don't think groundwater is going to last forever. So we're going to hire a consultant to tell us how to solve it. 1970, they hire a consultant who comes back with 6 different projects. 3 of them kind of to the east. One of them says, go to Dworshak and get the water and bring it back. Here's the reincarnation of the Potlatch River one. and bring it back. And then there's a third one that builds a reservoir up at Laird Park, lets it flow a little ways, and brings it back. So that's 3 of the projects. And then there's another 3. One of them goes to the Snake River and pumps it up and into Pullman and then to Moscow. This one uses Big Bear and Little Bear Creeks in the Troy watershed. This one uses the reservoir up high again, but lets the water flow all the way down before it pumps it from Palouse. 6 different projects. They looked in detail, pretty good detail, in how much it would cost. These are the costs. The Snake River project is the cheapest one, about $15 million in 1970. You project that forward, that's about a $107 million project. So with $107 million, they could have solved the problem back then, but a $107 million project is a big project. Okay, so they come out with another report that says, you know, this is really complicated, we really don't know about it, so we're not going to say that we should force folks to make a surface water choice on the basis of what we know. So we're going to keep studying the problem, and we'll tell you when we have a better idea of what needs to happen. Okay, so we're still in the early 70s. Remember that the dams on the lower Snake and the Columbia are being finished, right? The dams are wrapping up. The Corps of Engineers is kind of looking for work, and people are estimating that the Northwest is going to boom. We're going to need all kinds of electricity for this booming population, especially in Seattle. So there's this asymptotic curve for peak power requirements estimated. So we need power. The Corps of Engineers says we need power for these folks. Okay? But we don't need power all day long. So this is the time of day. The peak power happens about 6 p.m. according to their curve, but there's times during the day when we're not using too much power. So if we could build our power generating facilities to kind of store power during these low use times and use that power during the high need times, we wouldn't need to build as big a generating facilities. So that's kind of what they want to be able to do. And the way to do that is use what's called pump storage. So they had proposals to look at the river and find places where they could pump water out of the river when they didn't need to use the electricity, pump it up to the breaks, and then when they needed peak power, let that water go back down through a turbine and generate the peak power, bring it back into the river. So the folks in Pullman said, and Moscow said, hey, what if you built that reservoir up by around Uniontown and you pumped just a little bit of extra water up there? We could take some of that water and that would solve our problem and you'd still be able to do your pump storage. So it was a way to kind of piggyback on a Corps of Engineering project to get the water that we needed without spending $107 million. So they started working on that. They sent letters to the representatives and said, we really want to do this. We're behind you 100%. Senator McClure got it introduced as a line item in the budget. The Corps of Engineers got money to do the full feasibility study, and they came to town to do the public meeting, and turned out that maybe not everybody wanted to do this, right? Maybe the people who lived in Uniontown didn't want a reservoir in their backyard, right? And so their group formed called OPAL, Organization for the Preservation of Agricultural Land, that said, we do not want this. So the public meeting happens, and a delegation of more than 900 people showed up, and only one person spoke in support of this project. Everyone else who spoke said, we don't want this project. And not only that, we don't even think we should have a Corps of Engineers, right? And so, as you might guess, that project went away like the first project. But this OPAL said, we got to stop this group of people who's making these project proposals without talking to us. So we don't want to stop now. We want to make sure that they don't propose anything without going through the elected officials. And based upon that, this informal group that had formed back in the 60s kind of said, you know, maybe we should just quit doing these things if it's not what the people want. So the group that had worked in the 60s kind of went underground at that point. Okay? In the meantime, now they have computers, and the computers are able to make simulations of what they think the water levels are going to do over time. So these are the simulations, one's for Pullman, one's for Moscow, of what they think the water levels are going to do over time, and the underground group is making measurements to see what it's actually doing. And you can see that the water levels are going down faster than what the computer model says. Okay, so they say, well, that maybe doesn't bode well for the computer model, but we'll give it a couple more years. The guy that's kind of in charge of doing a lot of the work in those days dies in 1984. They reconvene this unofficial group, and now they have more measurements, and they say, yep, the water level's going down faster than our computer model thinks it should. So maybe we got an issue with our computer model. So what they recommend is we should keep monitoring things, and we should get a better model, right? So that's what they're going to focus their work on in the near term, 1984. Okay. So you wonder, why does this matter? If it's going down a foot a year and we've got 1,000 feet of aquifer, it's 1,000 years before we run out of water. Why do we care? We care because it's not up to us. And we don't own the water, but the state owns the water. And there are statutes about how we can use the water. And in Idaho, this is the main statute. And what the main statute says is you can't have water if taking water out of the aquifer lowers the water levels more, or you take more out than you think is being put in. So it's a basic balance. The state says you can't take more out than's going in. And if you do, we're not going to let you have any water. So it doesn't matter if we got 1,000 years worth. We got to make it so that it stays forever. That's what the statute says. Okay? So 1987, WSU files in Washington to drill their well number 7, which they now have. And in response to that, the state of Idaho says, we're protesting this because we already know you're taking water out more than is being recharged, and this is going to be more water. Our new model, we have a new model now, says that if you increase even at a rate as 1% per year, we're never going to get there. So we're protesting your application. So Idaho protests Washington State's application, a cross-state protest. Okay, Idaho says maybe we should get together and figure this out. We're 2 states, but we can get together and figure it out. Department of Ecology in Washington says, yeah, that's a good idea. Let's get together, figure out how to do it, and let's involve the cities and the universities so we can all kind of try to give as much local control as possible and still stay within the state statutes. And so based upon that, the committee reforms formally, and they have these formal agreements to say we're going to form this Pullman Moscow Water Resources Committee that's going to work with the agencies and be the forum for public input from the local governments and the local community. Okay? So they come up with a groundwater management plan that has a whole bunch of roles. I won't go through these exhaustively because we're kind of running out of time. But what the committee basically does is leverages its resources by all learning as a group. It gathers data and refines the model. Okay? So remember, we can't take out more than is being recharged, but a lot of these statutes have this thing, a however, right? There's a however in there. So maybe you can take out more than is being recharged if you got this program that exists or will exist to bring things into balance. So if you got a plan that's going to bring it into balance, we're okay. We don't have to put the hammer down on you. But that plan has to be bringing it into balance within a time period acceptable to the Director of Water Resources and at reasonable pumping levels. So we don't want to take it down 999 feet and then balance it out. It's got to be reasonable pumping levels and within a reasonable time. So now our new model, here's our new model, fancier than our older model. There's 2 lines in here that are important. The top one is what would happen to the water levels if we increased at 1% per year. The other one is what would happen if we just all of a sudden pumped 125% more than we were in 85, and when would it stabilize? So what they decided back then was 20 years was an acceptable time, and about 25 feet of decline was an acceptable level. So they made a plan that said, we need to bring it into balance in 20 years, and we need to do it at a point where we've only lost about 25 feet of water level. Here's the plan, 1992. It's the same plan we're working to today. Okay, the goals, you see, have the numbers from the model that basically put you into that time frame and into that water level thing. How are we doing? Okay, so this is from 1992 when the plan started to the present. And this line, the red line, is 1% increase per year. The green line is that ceiling, the 125% ceiling. And these blue bars are the actual pumping. So the goals were 125% and 1%. You can see they missed the 1% right there. But otherwise, pumping has been way below the goals. So we've met the targets. We've met what the plan says over that whole time. And it hasn't been easy. They've done a lot of things. There's been a lot of things that you'll see probably up on the 3rd floor about how they've worked to do this. So what are the trends from 1992 to 2015? Population of the counties has gone up 22%, right? So 22% more people lived here than did in 1992, but pumping's gone down 8%. So we've got 22% more people, 8% lower pumping. So you've done a good job of conserving and trying to fix leaks and do things smart. Unfortunately, the water levels kept going down, right? So it's gone down another 22 feet. So again, the water model from back then doesn't appear to have predicted what actually the aquifer behaves like well enough for us to come into balance. The water level decline has gone down, or it's been reduced in the past 10 years to 0.6 of a foot from a foot a year. But it's still going down. So it's still going down faster than it needs to be sustainable. So what to do? This is kind of a question for the future. I'm supposed to talk about history, so I'll say, well, there's some things we can do. We can use less inside. We can use less outside. We can reuse some of the stuff that we've already used once, and we can find more basic options, right? So those are things that are going to be happening in the future, what to do, and we don't have time to go through that now, but I have to finish with a couple of quizzes that are related to this. Quiz 4 is, will decisions made today have an impact in the future? Yes or no? These are softball quizzes, okay, right? Yes. Okay, so the next question is, does it follow that decisions made in the past have an impact in the present? So what we're living with now is some ways a result of decisions that were made in the past, right? So, at least from my logical standpoint, that means history matters, right? So we can learn from history, and I think we need to learn from history, but we also have to work to the future, and that's what's up to you folks and what will happen from now on. So I think I made that in a reasonable amount of time. Thank you for listening and being patient.
Thank you, Steve. Do you have time to take a couple questions?
Sure, if anybody has questions. Yes?
How much do you think that recent droughts are affecting these water levels? Was that the Grand Ron that was going down, or is it one of them, or is it both?
They're both kind of going down. The Grand Ron is on such a long time scale that anything that happens this year, we won't see in Grand Ron water levels for a long time. The upper aquifer is a little bit shorter time period, but we really don't see year-to-year comparisons between droughts. If we had a multiple-year drought, we might see faster decline starting in a year or 2 years in the upper aquifer. The water that's in the lower aquifer has been age dated to about 20,000 years, so it takes a long time for the water to get down there. One of the things about these fingers of basalt that are kind of coming out against the granites is there are theories that some of the water can get into the aquifer quickly in these ancient stream channels, but the stuff that's just percolating its way down really slowly takes a really long time to get there. Yeah. And one of the things with climate change is the predictions are that it'll actually get wetter here instead of drier, but it'll get wetter in spikier ways where there'll be more severe storms and they won't tend to be as much snow as rain. So there'll be more precipitation, it'll be rain, and it'll be spikier, which means more runoff. And really what you'd like to do for recharge is have nice slow movement so that it has time to get into the aquifer system. So it's a big unknown about what climate change might impact here, except it'll be warmer and people will be watering their grass more and things like that. Yes?
I thought that basically Pullman didn't have the Robuchon aquifer that it pinched out between, but you said the artesian well was probably on them back then, or they run out, or is that changed, or am I misunderstanding?
The Wanapum's really thin, and the South Fork kind of cuts into the Wanapum, so any water that could move sideways in the Wanapum could get to the stream, and they used a lot of that water. It might have been not a really large supply of water. There's a thought that a lot of that water may come off of Bald Butte and run in from the south, and a lot of it ran into the streams and ran away. So there's not really very much thickness of Wanapum over there. And even in Moscow, the Wanapum rocks aren't really where we get the upper aquifer water. It's that sediment, the vantage sediment between the Grand Run and the Wanapum. There's up to 400 feet of sediment between the Wanapum and the Grand Run in Moscow. Yes, Tom?
Where does the Grand Run start? I mean, when we talk about the Palouse Basin, we don't have to go very far out of town here, and we're out of it, right?
Well, that's a good question. You know, the drawing that I showed you that had the picture of the boundary goes all the way out to Colfax. And there's just lots of uncertainty to the west and the north because we don't have a lot of wells that tell us what's down there. But in Colfax, the water levels don't go down like they go down in Pullman and Moscow. So it's a pretty safe bet that the water basin doesn't make it to Colfax. The rocks go all the way to Portland almost, but the basin itself, where the water is stored, doesn't make it probably past, we're thinking past maybe Smoot Hill or a little bit west of Smoot Hill. And it may make it as far north as the city of Palouse, but we're not even sure that it makes it as far as Palouse. It may cut off around Kamiak Gap. And to figure these things out, you've got to drill these really deep wells that cost hundreds of dollars a foot. And so you could spend so much money trying to find out where the basin ends that you wouldn't have anything left to do anything with it. So it's kind of a guesswork thing for the geologists to figure out what's going on.
My point was, past the golf course, I mean, there's different water issues out in Troy
Right.
and Erie in those areas.
Well, we know that the granites, Moscow Mountain and Paradise Ridge and the quartzites, those are basin boundaries. And Buffalo Hump, you know, when you're going over towards Troy and you get over the top of the hill and you're just about to the landfill, Buffalo Hump is also a border. So things to the east are going to flow into the Clearwater and it's going to be a different basin. So that's the eastern basin. We're pretty sure of that. The western basin we're not so sure of, and the northern boundary we're not so sure of either. So it's somewhere between 100 and 500 square miles, if those numbers mean anything to you. And here's some other numbers that have some meaning. We get about 20 inches of precipitation a year here. You know, we get more in the east and less in the west, about 20 inches. Most of that water goes to the plants. Some, you know, the wheat is a plant, the grass is a plant, the trees are plants. Some of the water runs off, some of it gets evaporated. About 3/10 of an inch out of that 20 inches gets recharged into the aquifer. I mean about 2/10. I always get this wrong. It's about 2/10 of an inch gets recharged into the aquifer. And if you take how much we pump and add it up and spread it out over the basin, it's about 3/10 of an inch. So 2/10 of an inch is going in and 3/10 of an inch is coming out. And that's happening year after year after year. Yes?
Is there a difference in the quality or the taste of the water from the two different aquifers?
Yeah, the upper aquifer water has a lot of minerals in it, and so you can even taste irony. The city of Moscow gets about 30% of their water from the upper aquifer, but they put it through a sand filtration system to take a lot of the minerals out. And then they blend it with the lower aquifer water, so you don't really tell, you can't really tell. But if you were drinking purely upper aquifer water, like back in the 50s and 60s, you'd be able, anybody from here been drinking it back then? Was it pretty tasty back then?
You water your T-shirt, you wash your T-shirt once and you had to go.
That's those farmhouse guys. They didn't water their T-shirts very often. Yes?
Go ahead. One last question.
Well, in terms of long-term planning, if the prediction is that we're going to get a lot more rainfall in this area, then it seems like having a reservoir would be a wise thing for us to do, so that we can collect the surface runoff from that water, especially if it comes in the patterns that you're talking about, the spikiness, where it's not going to infiltrate into the ground. We're not, a lot of it, or I shouldn't say it that way, a lot of it's going to run off. Well, if it runs off into a reservoir, we can have that water.
Yeah, and a reservoir is something that should be considered for the future. Most of the reservoirs that we would need to build would have to be on the north side of the mountain because there's really not topography that we can build a sizable reservoir on this side. But when you build a reservoir, you're displacing lots of habitat, right? And then you're going to have to treat the water because it is surface water. And so it's going to be expensive. And then the reservoir is not going to be right in your backyard, so you're going to convey it. So it's going to cost a lot. You're going to have to treat it, but it may well be the option that ends up being preferred. There's another option of taking the water from the stream and treating it and trying to store it underground, using the aquifer as the reservoir. And so a lot of people think that's the way to go, but the water that's underground is 20,000 years old and it doesn't have a lot of yucky stuff in it. Even when you treat that surface water, there are people that are concerned with putting any of that surface water down below. So all of the solutions have pluses and minuses, right? We could conserve, and that would help us, and if everybody quit watering outside, we might get that 2/10, 3/10 to balance out for right now. But then when 1,000 more people move to town, how are we going to do that, right? And so conservation can put out the time when we need to solve the problem, but eventually we're going to need to get more water somewhere. And they're all expensive, and they all make some people angry.
Well, thank you again, Steve, so much. And I just want to say a personal thank you to Steve, because for the last 18 months, he has been exceedingly patient with me. I knew nothing about water, really, except that it came out of my tap. And not only has he answered all of my questions, however silly they might sound, but he has also let me farm him out to many speaking engagements to get people excited about waterways. He spoke at League of Women Voters, at the Lions Club, upon my request. So I really appreciate that, Steve, and thank you for once again being here with us tonight. So
Thank you.
I really hope that you'll find time to come back and really take in the exhibit. I don't think anybody probably had enough time just yet to really get all of the components that are available here. It's a really wonderful learning opportunity, and as Tom mentioned, the Smithsonian is our national museum system, and not everyone has the ability to go to Washington, D.C. It's really special that we have access to it here in Moscow, so I hope that you will take the time to enjoy it in the next 6 weeks. And if you have any questions, please feel free to get in touch with me at the Historical Society. But thank you all, and travel safely tonight. Thank you for bringing the winter weather.
And how about a hand for Dulcie?
Oh,